What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That was the question Harold found himself staring into as the television glowed across the dim room. The night was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the buzzing static of the cable box that struggled to keep a signal. Harold sat in his recliner, a glass of water untouched beside him, his hands resting like forgotten tools on the armrests. He was 68 years old, and most nights felt like this, silent, gray, and heavier than the walls around him. The days blurred together. Retirement wasn't the adventure people promised him it would be. Instead, it felt like exile. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years earlier, and since then, the house had grown quieter and colder, a place where memories lived louder than any visitor ever did. His children called, yes, but mostly to check off a duty, not because they wanted to hear his voice. Harold used to build things. Machines, models, small inventions that no one asked for but that gave him a reason to wake up in the morning. He'd worked as an engineer for decades, designing parts for manufacturing plants across the Midwest. The job was never glamorous, but it was honest, and Harold was good at it. Yet when he retired, when they threw him a cake and coffee party at the plant and shook his hand one last time, no one told him that the hardest part wasn't the leaving. It was the emptiness that came after. He had tried to keep busy, of course. A half-finished telescope sat in the garage, collecting dust alongside rusted tools. Margaret had teased him about it once, telling him he was going to discover aliens before the government did. But after she died, Harold couldn't bring himself to touch it again. It was as though the telescope reminded him not of the stars but of everything he had lost. And now, most nights, he watched TV until he fell asleep, waiting for the next day to arrive like a rerun he had already seen 100 times. That night, however, something unusual happened. The news anchor introduced a late-night segment, an interview clip with Elon Musk. Harold wasn't a follower of tech moguls or billionaires. To him, those people lived on another planet, untouchable. But something about the way the anchor framed it caught Harold's ear, a message to anyone who thinks their best years are behind them. The clip rolled. Elon Musk, seated on a stage, his voice steady but urgent, looked straight at the camera and said, "What if the best work of your life happens after everyone else counts you out? What if you're not done? What if you're just beginning?" Harold felt the words land like a pebble dropped in water, rippling through the stillness of his mind. He chuckled at first, shaking his head. "Easy for him to say," Harold muttered, reaching for the remote. But he didn't change the channel. Something in the way Musk's eyes burned, unafraid, as though he carried the weight of entire worlds, kept Harold frozen. The interview continued, Musk talking about Mars colonies, the need to dream beyond limitations, the courage to keep building even when failure was certain. Harold leaned forward without realizing it, his heart tapping faster than it had in weeks. A strange thought crossed his mind: when was the last time he had felt inspired? Not just entertained or distracted, but truly inspired. He couldn't remember. For years now, his life had been about survival, about making it to the next doctor's appointment, the next birthday, the next holiday dinner where he'd sit quietly at the edge of conversations. But inspired? No. That had left him long ago. Now here was this man, half his age, twice his energy, talking about possibilities as if the universe itself were still wide open. Harold muttered again, though softer this time, "What if he's right?" He thought about the telescope in the garage. Dust covered the lenses, screws lay scattered in a jar, the plans unfinished. He had abandoned it after Margaret's funeral, telling himself he had no reason to finish. But what if he did? What if finishing it wasn't about astronomy or science at all, but about proving to himself that he wasn't finished either? His chest tightened at the thought. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was dangerous at his age. Maybe no one would care. And yet, as Musk's voice carried on about pushing boundaries, Harold felt a flicker inside him that he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of rebellion. He remembered being 25, standing in his first workshop, building a model engine from spare parts, telling Margaret that he was going to change the world. She had laughed, kissed his forehead, and said, "Then change mine first." He had. For 50 years, they had built a life together. But when she was gone, he stopped building. He stopped daring. He stopped living. The television screen glowed brighter as if it too demanded his attention. Musk's final words before the clip ended were simple, almost defiant: "The future is what we choose to build. So, build." Harold sat back, staring at the ceiling. Build. The word echoed in his chest. His eyes stung, and he wiped at them quickly, annoyed at himself. He wasn't some kid with a dream anymore. He was an old man with arthritis in his hands and medicine bottles on his nightstand. Still, the question gnawed at him: what if he wasn't done? What if his story wasn't over? The television returned to commercials, but Harold hardly noticed. He was too busy thinking. For the first time in years, his mind was racing, not with worry or regret, but with possibility. He looked at the glass of water on the table, then at the garage door down the hallway. Dust or not, that telescope was still waiting. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. He exhaled, almost laughing, because it was absurd. But absurdity felt better than emptiness. He whispered aloud, "All right, Margaret. Maybe one more project." His voice cracked, but the words carried weight. The house was still quiet, but something had shifted in it, like the faint hum of electricity before a machine roars to life. Harold didn't know what tomorrow would look like. He didn't know if his body would keep up, if his children would understand, or if the world would care. But tonight, for the first time in years, he cared. He turned off the television and sat in the darkness, not as a man waiting for life to pass, but as a man daring to ask, what if? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Before the flicker of inspiration from that late-night broadcast, Harold's life had followed a quiet, predictable rhythm, the kind that wore a man down not because it was full of chaos but because it was full of nothing at all. Each morning he woke up at 6:30, not because he had anywhere to be but because his body was still trained by decades of factory whistles and early commutes. He shuffled into the kitchen, made a pot of coffee, and sat by the small window overlooking the street where he used to watch neighborhood kids ride their bikes. These days, the street was empty by morning, everyone locked away in their jobs, their screens, their busy lives. He would sit there with his mug, hands wrapped tight around it for warmth, staring at the sky and wondering what he was supposed to do with another day that felt exactly like the last. After Margaret passed away, the house had become a mausoleum of sorts. Her knitting basket still sat near the couch, the last half-finished scarf still looped around the needles. Her perfume bottle, nearly empty, sat on the bathroom shelf, though Harold hadn't touched it in years because one whiff could unravel him. Every corner of the house carried her absence like a shadow. He had tried to clear things out once, his daughter Susan suggesting it would be healthier, but when he stood in the middle of the bedroom with a trash bag in hand, surrounded by her dresses and photographs, he collapsed onto the bed and sobbed until the bag was forgotten. The truth was, he wasn't ready to move on, and maybe he never would be. Retirement hadn't been kind either. At 65, when they handed him that gold-plated watch and a cheap sheet cake in the company break room, he felt proud for a brief moment. 42 years of service, and they clapped politely before everyone returned to their desks. The next day, Harold woke up without an alarm clock for the first time in decades, and the silence was suffocating. For a man who had always defined himself by what he built, by the hands-on grind of designing and fixing, the sudden lack of purpose hollowed him out faster than age ever could. He had thought maybe he would travel, but Margaret was already sick then, her body betraying her piece by piece, and he chose to stay close, to be her caretaker. After she was gone, the idea of traveling alone seemed ridiculous, almost cruel. He spent a lot of time thinking about the past instead. About the decisions he didn't make, the chances he didn't take. When he was young, Harold had dreamed of building machines that could change how people lived, ideas sketched on napkins and notebook pages during lunch breaks at the plant. One design he remembered vividly was for a compact, affordable solar generator. He had tinkered with prototypes in the garage, soldering wires late into the night, Margaret occasionally bringing him coffee and telling him not to burn the house down. He truly believed in it. But when their second child was born and bills began piling up, Harold put the sketches away, convincing himself that practicality mattered more than invention. It was the right thing at the time, or so he thought, but the regret never really left him. He saw others rise in the tech world, men his age becoming millionaires off patents, and sometimes he couldn't help but wonder what his life might have been if he'd dared a little more. Now, all that was left of that version of Harold sat in boxes, yellowing blueprints, broken circuit boards, dusty notebooks filled with numbers only he could understand. He hadn't opened them in years. His children, Susan and Michael, never understood that side of him. To them, he was Dad, the steady provider, the man who showed up to work and came home with grease on his hands, not the dreamer who once talked about building energy solutions or mapping the stars. They saw his retirement as an ending, not a transition. Susan would say, "Dad, you've worked hard your whole life, now just relax." Michael, who lived states away, rarely called except on holidays, and when he did, he always sounded rushed, as if talking to his father was another appointment to check off the list. Harold didn't blame them. The world had sped up, and he was just an old man slowing down. Still, the loneliness clung to him like fog. Evenings were the hardest. He would sit in the recliner, the TV droning, his mind wandering to the life he thought he would have. Sometimes he replayed the same memory over and over, standing under a blanket of stars with Margaret on their honeymoon in Montana. She had leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Promise me we'll always keep looking up." He promised, and for years he kept it. They bought a cheap telescope and spent countless nights in the backyard, charting constellations, pointing out planets. But after she died, he stopped looking up altogether. The stars were still there, but they only reminded him of promises broken by time. His health added to the weight. Arthritis stiffened his joints, making it harder to tinker with tools the way he used to. His back ached when he walked too far, and the doctor kept reminding him to take it easy, as if slowing down was the only prescription left for a man his age. Every checkup ended with a new pill bottle, and Harold's nightstand looked more like a pharmacy than a bedroom table. He hated it. He hated feeling like his only role in life now was to manage decline, to wait for the inevitable. The neighbors hardly noticed him anymore either. The world belonged to younger families with noisy children and two-car garages filled with scooters and soccer balls. Harold would wave when they passed, but often they barely looked his way. He felt invisible, like a relic of a bygone era. Sometimes he wondered if this was all old age was meant to be, sitting in silence, watching life move on without you. That half-finished telescope in the garage was the clearest symbol of who he used to be. He had started it years ago with such excitement, convinced he was building something that would let him see farther and clearer than ever before. It wasn't just about the stars, it was about proving to himself that he could still create. But after Margaret's death, the project froze in time, as though stopping it was the only way to stop his grief. Dust settled on it like a burial shroud. Whenever he opened the garage door, he avoided looking directly at it, as if making eye contact with his unfinished dream would be too painful. And so Harold lived, day after day, trapped between the memories of what once was and the silence of what remained. To the outside world, he was just another retiree living out his days in a small-town home. But inside, in the quiet corners of his heart, there was still a flicker, a whisper of the man who once believed in possibilities. He just didn't know how to hear it anymore. That was Harold's life before the shift, routine, heavy with regret, colored by loneliness and invisibility. A life where the question wasn't what's next but how much longer. Yet all it took was one unexpected spark, one voice from a television screen, to make that flicker start to grow again. The next morning Harold woke with the same stiffness in his joints, the same quiet creak of the house, but something felt different. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee as if it might offer answers. The echo of Elon Musk's words from the night before still clung to him. What if the best work of your life happens after everyone else counts you out? He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just late-night nonsense, but the idea had burrowed deep. As he sipped the coffee, Harold looked toward the garage door. He hadn't done that in years, not intentionally. It was as if the telescope in there was calling to him. But almost instantly, the counter-voice rose in his head, sharp and cynical. "You're too old for this. You can barely climb the stairs without your knees giving out, and you think you're going to finish a telescope? What then, build rockets?" He set the mug down harder than he meant to, frustrated with himself. It wasn't just his own doubt that haunted him, it was the voices of others. His daughter Susan had always been protective, sometimes too much so. Just last month when he mentioned maybe picking up a small part-time job at the hardware store, she had frowned and said, "Dad, you don't need to prove anything anymore. You've worked hard enough. Just enjoy life." But what she didn't understand was that, enjoy life, didn't mean much if all it involved was waiting for the days to pass. She saw rest as reward, but to Harold it felt like erasure. Then there was his doctor. The man barely older than Susan, with a bright smile and a tone that carried more sympathy than respect. "Harold, you need to slow down. Stress and exertion at your age aren't wise. Focus on walking, eating right, and taking your meds. That's the best way to keep steady. Keep steady." As if being steady was all that mattered anymore. As if his body was nothing but a fragile shell to be preserved, not used. Harold knew they meant well, but every time someone told him to slow down, a piece of him shrank. He felt like society had written him off, tucking him into a box labeled senior citizen, where he was expected to stay put until the end. And yet, even with all those voices, Musk's words thundered louder. He couldn't ignore them. That night he turned on the television again, searching, almost desperate, to see another clip. And there it was, an older interview where Musk was asked about failure. He leaned forward on the couch as Musk answered calmly, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Harold's jaw tightened. Failure. The word haunted him. He thought of the solar generator design from his younger years, the one he never pursued. He thought of the telescope abandoned in the garage, the promise to Margaret that he would keep looking up. He thought of the relationships frayed with his children, the phone calls that always felt shallow. He had failed in more ways than one. But maybe Musk was right, maybe failure wasn't the end. Maybe it was proof that he had tried. The glimmer of hope was small but real. For the first time in years, Harold found himself scribbling on a scrap of paper, jotting ideas, listing tools he might need, sketching rough diagrams like he used to. His hands shook from arthritis, the lines uneven, but the act itself was intoxicating. Yet just as quickly as it came, the doubt crashed back in. His mind filled with arguments. What if you hurt yourself? What if you embarrass yourself? What if Susan finds out and insists you stop? What if the neighbors laugh? He pictured them shaking their heads, saying, "Old Harold's gone crazy." He dropped the pen and rubbed his temples. It was a war inside him, hope battling despair, rebellion battling resignation. One moment he could see himself in the garage, finishing the telescope, lifting it toward the stars with pride. The next moment he imagined himself collapsing from the effort, alone on the cold garage floor. That image terrified him. The days that followed became a tug-of-war. Some mornings he felt fired up, determined to take that step into the garage. Other mornings he sank back into the recliner, convincing himself it wasn't worth the risk. He avoided phone calls from Susan, afraid she would sense something in his voice. He even avoided Michael's holiday check-in, knowing his son would dismiss the whole idea before Harold could finish explaining. But then came another spark. One afternoon, while scrolling aimlessly online, Harold stumbled across a short video of Musk speaking at a conference. The soundbite was simple, almost careless, but it hit Harold like lightning. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are against you. He froze, staring at the screen. Important enough. He whispered the words under his breath, again and again. What was important enough to him? The telescope? Maybe. But deeper than that, it was the act of creating, of proving to himself that he was still capable of doing more than just existing. That mattered. That was important enough. That night, he dreamed of Margaret. She was standing in the backyard, the telescope beside her, the stars sharp and brilliant overhead. She smiled at him the way she always had, gentle but strong, and said, "Promise me we'll always keep looking up." He woke with tears on his face, heart pounding, and for once the sadness didn't crush him, it propelled him. He sat up in bed, whispering, "I haven't kept that promise, but I still can." The inner war wasn't over, but the sides were clearer now. One voice told him he was too old, too broken, too late. The other voice, fueled by Musk's defiance and Margaret's memory, told him he still had something left to give. He didn't know which would win yet, but he knew he couldn't keep hiding from the battle. The garage waited. The telescope waited. And so did the part of Harold that still wanted to live. Harold didn't walk straight into the garage the next morning, but something in him had shifted. He stood in the kitchen with his coffee, staring at the narrow hallway that led to the garage door. The air felt heavier, like the universe itself was waiting for him to decide. He chuckled softly, shaking his head at the thought. 68 years old and acting like a teenager about to sneak out past curfew, he muttered. But the truth was, fear and excitement tangled inside him in equal measure. He finished his coffee, washed the mug, and dried it with a trembling hand. Then, almost without thinking, he walked to the garage door, placed his palm on the handle, and pushed it open. The smell hit him first, dust, oil, and the faint metallic tang of forgotten tools. The light from the kitchen spilled across the floor, revealing the outlines of boxes, paint cans, and the familiar shape of the workbench. And there it was, in the corner, half buried under a tarp, the telescope. Harold's chest tightened. He walked toward it slowly, each step deliberate, until he was close enough to reach out. He pulled the tarp away, coughing as dust rose in the air. The sight nearly broke him. The telescope looked like a relic, its unfinished frame rusted at the edges, screws missing, lenses clouded with grime. It wasn't just unfinished, it was abandoned, neglected, forgotten, just like he felt. For a long moment he simply stood there, staring, grief rising in waves. But then another feeling cut through the sorrow, anger. Not anger at the telescope, not even at himself, but at the idea that this was it, that his life was supposed to end with half-finished projects and unfulfilled promises. He clenched his jaw and whispered, "No," the word was small but sharp. "No. I'm not done." His hands moved almost before his mind caught up. He cleared the workbench, tossing aside boxes and old rags, creating space as if he were opening a wound that needed air. He found a rag, dampened it with water from the sink, and began wiping the telescope frame. The dust lifted, revealing the smooth steel beneath. For the first time in years, Harold felt alive. His hands ached, yes, his back protested, but the ache was proof of effort, proof of motion. He kept working until sweat beaded on his forehead. When he finally sat down on the stool, breathless, the telescope gleamed just a little brighter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, Harold sat in his recliner with a notebook balanced on his lap. He opened it to a blank page and began sketching, just like he had decades earlier. His lines were shakier now, but the act itself was exhilarating. He drew the adjustments needed to fix the frame, listed the tools he would need, noted the replacement parts he might order. His mind buzzed with calculation. For hours he worked, the television dark, the house silent except for the scratching of his pen. When he finally set the notebook down, he realized his heart was beating faster than it had in months. Sleep came late, and when it did, it was filled with visions of stars, of Mars glowing red against the black sky, of Margaret's voice telling him to keep looking up. The next day, Harold walked to the library, something he hadn't done in years. The librarian, surprised to see him, smiled warmly as he asked for books on astronomy, engineering, and even some recent publications about space travel. He carried them home like treasure. That afternoon, he read for hours, his mind soaking up facts about Mars colonization, renewable energy, and even Neuralink. The strange idea of connecting minds to machines. The words were complicated, yes, but he understood enough to feel the fire stoke hotter. It was as if the world he had once loved, science, invention, possibility, was opening its doors again. He couldn't stop thinking about Musk. The man wasn't perfect, Harold knew that, but what struck him was his audacity. Who else dared to speak of colonizing Mars as if it were a realistic goal? Who else pushed boundaries so recklessly, refusing to bow to doubt? Harold admired that courage, even envied it. He had spent so much of his life choosing safety over risk, and now, nearing 70, he finally wondered, what if he had dared more? But regret was useless unless it sparked something. And now it was sparking. By the third day, Harold was back in the garage with a screwdriver in hand, tightening bolts, adjusting gears, testing lenses. He moved slowly, carefully, but with purpose. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like an act of rebellion. Not against age itself, but against the expectation that he should simply fade away. He could hear Susan's voice in his head, "Dad, you don't need to prove anything." And maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But he did need to prove something to himself, that he was still here, still capable, still alive. In the evenings, Harold sat at his desk, watching videos of Musk talking about rockets, artificial intelligence, and the future of humanity. He jotted down notes, not because he thought he would build rockets himself, but because the mindset was contagious. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are against you. Harold read that line again and again, underlining it in his notebook. The odds were certainly against him, age, health, loneliness, but that didn't mean he couldn't try. A strange thing began to happen. For the first time in years, Harold found himself excited to wake up. He went to bed with plans in his head, woke with ideas waiting, and the long empty days that once weighed him down now felt like opportunities. The world outside hadn't changed, but Harold had. There was still a war inside him, moments when doubt crept back in, whispering that he was foolish, that this was just a phase. But each time the doubt grew loud, he remembered the telescope gleaming in the garage, the sketches in his notebook, the books stacked high on his desk, and he pressed on. He wasn't building a rocket to Mars. He wasn't inventing mind-machine interfaces. But he was doing something far more important. He was refusing to be erased. And with each bolt tightened, each diagram drawn, Harold felt the rebellion grow stronger. The seed had been planted, and though it was fragile, though it needed care, it was real. He was building again, not just machines but himself. And this time, he wasn't going to stop halfway. Days passed, and Harold found himself moving with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Each morning he rose not with dread but with quiet anticipation, his mind already thinking of the workbench, the telescope, the notes spread across his desk. The house still creaked with silence, Margaret's absence still lingered like a shadow, but there was something different now, purpose. Purpose didn't erase grief, but it softened it, gave it form, made it bearable. On the 7th day of his efforts, Harold decided he needed more than books and notebooks. He needed parts. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, dusted off from disuse, and typed in search after search. Telescope mirrors, lens cleaning kits, tracking mounts, even small motors. The internet was overwhelming, thousands of options, prices that made his eyes widen, but the act of searching, of considering, was thrilling. He ordered a few essentials, hesitating at the cost but telling himself it was worth it. It wasn't just money he was spending, it was investment in life itself. When the confirmation email came, he stared at it with the same giddy fear he used to feel when he and Margaret booked trips to places they had never been. He realized then that it wasn't just the telescope he was rebuilding. He was stepping into the unknown again, just like he had as a young man. That night, Harold dreamed vividly. He was standing on a Martian plain, the red dust swirling around his boots, the sky tinted but beautiful. Elon Musk was beside him, not as a celebrity but as a fellow traveler, pointing toward a colony in the distance where domes gleamed under the alien sun. "You came," Musk said simply, his voice calm, almost amused. Harold woke with his heart pounding, half smiling at the absurdity of the dream, but unable to shake the power of it. In the quiet dawn, he whispered, "I did come. I'm still here." When the packages arrived, Harold opened them like a child at Christmas. The fresh metal of new parts, the gleam of polished mirrors, the crisp smell of instruction manuals, they filled him with energy. He spent hours fitting pieces together, his fingers clumsy but determined, sweat dripping as he adjusted screws and wires. Sometimes he dropped a tool, cursed under his breath, and had to sit back to steady his trembling hands, but each setback only fueled his stubbornness. By the end of the second week, the telescope looked less like a relic and more like a machine with potential. One evening, Susan called again. "Hi, Dad. How are you holding up?" He hesitated, unsure whether to reveal what he was doing. Then, in a burst of pride, he said, "I've been working on the telescope again." There was a pause. "The one in the garage?" "Dad, that's great. I didn't know you still had the energy for that." Harold chuckled. "Neither did I. But I think it's time I finished what I started." Susan's voice softened. "I'm proud of you. Really. Just, don't push yourself too hard, okay?" He promised he wouldn't, though inside he knew he was pushing harder than he had in years. But it wasn't recklessness. It was necessity. This was survival of the spirit. As weeks turned into a month, Harold's work expanded beyond the telescope. The books he had borrowed led him to new questions. He read about sustainable living, about Musk's ventures with solar energy and electric cars, and he began sketching crude ideas in his notebook, ways to modify his home, to save energy, to simplify. He wasn't inventing anything groundbreaking, but he was thinking, imagining, solving problems. His mind, once dulled by monotony, was firing like a furnace. Yet doubt still visited him. One particularly cold night, as he sat staring at the telescope, he wondered what it was all for. He wasn't going to Mars. He wasn't building rockets. He was an old man tinkering in his garage. Would any of it matter? He nearly closed the notebook then, nearly folded the dream back into silence. But just as the doubt swelled, he remembered Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are against you." Harold whispered the line aloud, feeling its weight. He realized then that the telescope wasn't about stargazing or science alone. It was about proving to himself that he could still reach, still strive, still defy the odds of age. And that, he decided, mattered more than anything. With that clarity, he kept working. The breakthrough came on a crisp evening in early spring. Harold carried the telescope into the backyard, struggling under its weight but refusing to ask for help. He set it up carefully, adjusted the tripod, cleaned the lenses one last time, and pointed it toward the sky. The stars glittered above, sharp and infinite. With a trembling hand, he peered through the eyepiece. For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, the blurred shapes gave way to clarity. There it was, Jupiter, massive and glowing, its faint bands visible, its moons tiny but clear. Harold gasped, his eyes filling with tears. He hadn't seen a planet through a telescope in decades, and now here it was, real, radiant, alive. He laughed, the sound loud in the quiet night, startling even himself. He whispered, "Margaret, you'd love this. You'd tell me to keep looking." He stayed outside for hours, shifting the telescope, scanning the sky, jotting notes between observations. The cold bit at his fingers, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he was standing at the edge of discovery. The next day, something even stranger happened. Harold decided to share his joy. He wrote a short post online, clumsy but heartfelt, attaching a picture of the telescope in his yard. "First time looking through my old telescope in decades. I saw Jupiter and its moons last night. At 68, it feels like I'm just starting over." He expected nothing, maybe a like or two. But within hours, comments began to appear. Strangers congratulated him, told him he inspired them, shared their own stories of starting new projects later in life. One person wrote, "You're never too old to dream. Keep going, Harold." Reading those words, Harold felt something shift again. He wasn't alone. His rebellion wasn't just private anymore, it was connecting, resonating, spreading. Over the following weeks, Harold's small online updates drew more encouragement. He began joining forums about amateur astronomy, learning from others, sharing tips, laughing at his own mistakes. The isolation that had once weighed on him began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. One evening, after posting a photo of Saturn's rings, Harold received a private message from a young engineering student. "Mr. Bennett, your posts give me hope. If you can keep chasing dreams at your age, I can push through my studies. Thank you." Harold sat staring at the message for a long time, humbled. He had never imagined he could inspire anyone, let alone someone decades younger. It made him realize that his journey wasn't small, wasn't meaningless. It mattered, and not just to him. The telescope was no longer just a machine. It was a bridge, to Margaret, to strangers, to a version of himself he thought he had lost. He understood now that the unknown wasn't about space or Mars alone. It was about daring to step beyond comfort, beyond fear, into whatever remained of his own uncharted life. And as he stood once more in the garage, tools in hand, the words came to him with startling clarity, "I'm not done. Not yet." Harold's journey, though filled with small triumphs, was not a steady climb. For every night of wonder beneath the stars, there were mornings when his body protested with aches that seemed to mock his ambition. One particular morning, he struggled to rise from his chair, his knees stiff, his back refusing to straighten. The tools on his workbench glared at him like accusers, reminding him that no matter how much his spirit burned, his body was 68 years old and weary. He slumped in frustration, muttering, "What's the point if I can't even stand without groaning like an old fool?" The doubt crept back, dark and heavy, whispering that maybe his children had been right, maybe it was reckless to chase something new at his age. He shuffled to the mirror in the bathroom and stared at the sagging lines of his face, the thinning hair, the tired eyes. For a moment, he felt the weight of all his years pressing down, and he almost gave into it. But later that day, as he rested in the living room with the news playing in the background, Elon Musk's face appeared on the screen. The segment was about SpaceX's upcoming mission, the narrator speaking of risks, failures, and breakthroughs. Musk himself appeared, calm as ever, saying, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you're not innovating enough." Harold leaned forward, the words striking deep. He realized then that his stiff knees and tired back weren't failures, they were proof that he was pushing against the limits, innovating against the decline. He smiled bitterly, whispering, "All right, Elon, I hear you. Falling isn't the end. It's just part of the climb." Reinvigorated, he started to think differently. If his body was weaker, then he needed to adapt. He began small exercises each morning, stretches, light walks, breathing routines. At first, it was embarrassing how little he could do, but each day added a fraction of strength, a sliver of stamina. He treated his own body as another project, another invention to refine. He journaled his progress, not with numbers but with feelings, less pain in my knees today, breath came easier, felt stronger when carrying the telescope outside. These small notes became his hidden ledger of renewal. Yet the outside world was not always supportive. One weekend, Susan came by for a surprise visit. She found Harold in the garage, sweat soaking his shirt as he adjusted the telescope's motorized mount. "Dad," she said, concern heavy in her voice, "you need to take it easy. This is too much for you." He straightened slowly, catching his breath. "Too much. Susan, this is what's keeping me alive. I've been sitting still for years. That was killing me more than this ever will." She frowned, arms crossed. "I just don't want to lose you because you pushed too hard. You're not 30 anymore." Harold sighed, looking at her with both love and frustration. "No, I'm not 30. But I'm not dead either. And if I spend the years I have left sitting in that chair, doing nothing, I might as well be." Susan's eyes softened with tears. "I miss Mom, too, Dad. I just don't want to lose you the same way, suddenly, without warning." Harold stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You won't lose me, Susan. Not like that. If I go, it'll be with my eyes open, looking at the stars. That's not losing. That's living." She hugged him tightly then, and though her worry didn't vanish, she began to understand. Even so, the resistance wasn't only from family. His own neighbors sometimes gave him puzzled looks when they saw him wheeling equipment in and out of the garage. One evening, Mr. Peterson from across the street called out, "Harold, what are you doing with all that contraption? Planning to spy on us from outer space?" The tone was joking, but Harold heard the undertone of disbelief, maybe even ridicule. He forced a chuckle, replying, "No, just trying to see a little further than my front yard." Inside, though, the comment stung. Was he becoming the eccentric old man on the block, pitted or mocked for refusing to age quietly? But then, that night, as he gazed at Saturn's glowing rings through the eyepiece, the sting faded. He thought of Musk again, called crazy so many times, dismissed for impossible ideas, yet relentless in his pursuit. Harold whispered to himself, "Let them laugh. They don't see what I see." His online circle of fellow enthusiasts became his true allies. They celebrated his progress, advised him on modifications, even encouraged him to share more of his personal journey. At first, he resisted, his life felt too ordinary, too heavy with regret, but then he realized that it was precisely his ordinariness that made the story powerful. If he, an aging widower in a quiet town, could reignite his spark, maybe others could, too. So he wrote one night, candid and raw, "I thought my best years were behind me. My wife passed, my kids grew distant, and I sat in silence. But last month, I decided to finish what I started decades ago. I'm not building rockets, but I'm building myself again. Every night I look through this telescope, I feel younger, braver, more alive. And if you're reading this, I want you to know, it's never too late." The response was overwhelming. Dozens of comments poured in, strangers thanking him, telling him they felt seen, sharing their own struggles with age, loss, or fear. One woman wrote, "I'm 72 and just started painting again after 20 years. Thank you for reminding me I'm not too old." Another man said, "I'm 65 and thought it was over for me. Your words just lit a fire in me." Harold read each comment slowly, tears welling in his eyes. He wasn't just stargazing anymore, he was part of something larger, a constellation of souls daring to shine again. Still, resistance remained within. Some nights the loneliness returned like a cold wind, whispering that all the stars in the sky couldn't fill the empty chair beside him. He missed Margaret fiercely, her laugh, her sharp wit, the way she used to rest her hand on his arm during quiet moments. Looking through the telescope sometimes felt like reaching for her, for a connection across the infinite. One night, overwhelmed, he whispered into the eyepiece as though it were a bridge, "Margaret, am I doing the right thing? Am I making a fool of myself?" A breeze rustled the trees, and in the silence that followed, he felt an odd calm. He imagined her smile, the one that always encouraged him to keep going. Whether it was memory or something more, it steadied him. Renewal was not the absence of pain but the courage to move through it. As spring deepened, Harold noticed another renewal, his relationship with Susan. She called more often, curious about his progress, asking questions about the stars. One evening she even brought her teenage son, Ryan, to see the telescope. Ryan peered through the eyepiece, gasped, and exclaimed, "Wow, Grandpa. It looks like a real planet." Harold laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's because it is a real planet, Ryan." The boy grinned, wide-eyed, and Harold felt something stir, a connection across generations, a passing of wonder. For the first time in years, he wasn't just a burdened old man in his daughter's eyes. He was a guide, a source of inspiration. Resistance had not vanished, but renewal was stronger. Harold's world was expanding, like the universe itself, full of possibility and light. And in the quiet moments, when he stood beneath the stars, he no longer felt like an old man chasing a foolish dream. He felt like a pioneer, still charting unknown territory, still daring to go further. And he knew then that this was only the beginning. The weeks of progress, the telescope's triumphant return to life, the small victories online and with his family, all of it made Harold feel like he was finally breaking free from the cage of time. But life has a way of testing newfound strength, probing for weaknesses in the walls we build. One late night, as Harold leaned over the eyepiece trying to capture a clear view of Venus, a sharp pain shot through his chest, sudden and cruel. He froze, clutching the workbench, his breath caught like a trapped bird. For a terrifying moment, he thought this was it, the end sneaking up on him under the stars he had only just begun to rediscover. He staggered to the chair, sweat on his forehead, and sat motionless, counting each shallow breath, waiting for the pain to pass. It eventually did, leaving him shaken, pale, and trembling. The telescope stood beside him like a silent witness, its polished lens gleaming under the dim garage light. "Not now," he whispered to the empty room. "Not when I've just begun." For the first time in weeks, fear returned, not of dying, but of dying unfinished. The next morning, he told no one. Not Susan, not his doctor. He convinced himself it had just been stress, a passing moment, nothing to worry about. But inside, doubt gnawed at him. He moved slower, lifted less, hesitated before climbing the steps to the porch. The spark that had lit his heart began to flicker, threatened by the shadow of mortality. Even his nights with the telescope felt tainted. Where once he had felt awe, now he felt the ticking clock, the question, how many more times will I see this? He stopped posting online for a while, retreating into silence. Messages trickled in, "Harold, are you okay? We miss your updates," but he ignored them, ashamed of his weakness. One evening, Susan called again. Her voice was cheerful at first, talking about Ryan's science project, but then she grew quiet. "Dad, are you all right? You sound tired." He forced a laugh. "Just getting old, Susan. That's all." She didn't press, but he could hear the worry in her silence. After the call, he sat in the dim kitchen staring at his reflection in the window. The words, "just getting old," echoed, and he hated how easily they had come. Was that really it? Was he just waiting for the light to fade? That night, unable to sleep, Harold scrolled through his phone and stumbled upon a video of Musk speaking at a conference. The clip was grainy, the audio uneven, but the words cut through. "If something is important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it." Harold paused the video and replayed that sentence again and again. It was the same line that had first jolted him awake weeks ago, but now it struck deeper, sharper. The odds were against him, his age, his health, his loneliness, but wasn't that the very reason he had started this journey? To prove that odds were not destiny. He sat upright, a fire rekindling beneath the fear. The next morning, he wrote in his notebook, "Pain is not the end. Fear is not the end. Stopping is the end. And I refuse to stop." He returned to the telescope, though cautiously, pacing himself, resting more often. He began documenting not just the stars but his own body's struggles, the moments of weakness, the small recoveries. He wrote honestly online, confessing his scare, admitting his fear. To his surprise, the responses were not pity but solidarity. A man from Arizona wrote, "I had a heart attack at 64. Thought my life was over. Now I hike every weekend. You've got this, Harold." A woman replied, "Your honesty gives me courage. Thank you for sharing even the hard parts." Their words were like kindling, feeding the flame that had nearly gone out. He realized then that the flicker in the dark wasn't just his fear, it was also his hope, fragile but alive. He decided to fan it. Susan visited again, this time bringing Ryan, who bounded into the garage with excitement. "Grandpa, can we see the rings again?" Harold smiled, steadying himself as he adjusted the telescope. "Of course we can." When Ryan peered through the eyepiece and gasped, Harold felt something shift. He wasn't just chasing his own dreams anymore, he was passing the torch, sparking wonder in someone young enough to carry it forward. Later, as Susan watched them, her eyes softened. "Dad," she said quietly, "I'm glad you didn't give up." He looked at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "I almost did," he admitted. "But then I realized, I don't want my story to end with almost." That night, as Harold stood in the backyard alone, he looked up at the stars and whispered to Margaret, "I was afraid, love. Afraid of leaving too soon, of failing again. But I think fear is just proof that I'm alive. And as long as I'm alive, I'll keep reaching." The wind stirred, cool and gentle, and for a moment he felt her presence, warm and steady. The flicker grew brighter. He realized then that darkness was not the enemy, it was the canvas on which light could shine. And though his body might falter, his spirit burned with a defiance that no pain could extinguish. Harold Bennett, once resigned to silence, was now a man standing in the dark, holding a flicker that refused to die. And somewhere in the infinite sky above, he imagined Elon Musk smiling, not as a savior, but as a fellow dreamer reminding him, odds are just numbers, possibility is infinite. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The night of the chest pain remained etched in Harold's mind, but instead of paralyzing him, it became a turning point. He realized he could no longer ignore his body, nor could he allow fear to dictate his path. Renewal demanded resilience, and resilience meant preparation. So he saw his doctor, reluctantly admitting what had happened. The doctor frowned but did not scold him. Instead, she adjusted his medication, advised moderation, and encouraged his exercise. "Mr. Bennett, you don't have to stop," she said, surprising him. "You just have to pace yourself. There's a big difference between recklessness and determination." Harold left the office lighter, as though he had received permission to keep fighting. He spent the next weeks balancing his passion with care, his telescope nights tempered by morning walks, his tinkering balanced with rest. Slowly, he felt stronger. His heart no longer hammered with every exertion, his breathing steadied. What once seemed impossible now felt manageable. Still, he longed for something more, something beyond his backyard and his online posts. He wanted connection in the flesh, voices and faces sharing the same sky. So one day, after reading about a local astronomy club in the newspaper, he decided to attend. Driving to the community center felt like entering a different universe. His palms sweated on the steering wheel, his mind filled with doubts. Would they laugh at him? Would they see only an old man too late to the game? But when he arrived, telescope in hand, he was greeted with smiles and nods. People of all ages milled about, from teenagers with sleek equipment to retirees with weathered notebooks. One man in his 50s clapped him on the back. "Good to see another star chaser. What do you have there?" Harold proudly unveiled his restored telescope. The man whistled. "That's a beauty. Old school, but solid. You'll get great views with that. Relief flooded Harold. He wasn't mocked, he was welcomed. That night, under the dark open sky with a dozen others pointing lenses heavenward, Harold felt a surge of belonging. When it was his turn to share, he aimed his telescope at Saturn and stepped aside. A young girl peered through and squealed with delight. I see it. I really see it. Harold's chest swelled with pride. In that moment, he realized his telescope had become more than a personal project. It was a bridge to others, a source of wonder passed from one pair of eyes to another. Over the following months, Harold became a fixture at the club. He listened intently, asked questions, shared his progress. The others respected him not despite his age but because of it. You've got stories, one member told him. You've lived enough to know patience. That's half of astronomy, waiting for the sky to open. Harold laughed, realizing patience had been forced on him by life, but now it was a gift. With encouragement from the group, Harold decided to attempt something new, astrophotography. He had always loved looking through the eyepiece, but capturing an image, freezing the moment, felt like a new frontier. He bought a simple camera attachment, studied tutorials late into the night, and fumbled through countless failed attempts. At first, his pictures were blurry smears of light, disappointing and frustrating. He almost gave up, muttering, "Leave it to the young with their fancy gadgets." But then he remembered Musk's words, failure meant he was innovating. So he persisted, adjusting angles, recalibrating, waiting patiently for the sky to clear. Then, one crisp autumn evening, it happened. After hours of tinkering, Harold captured a clear image of Jupiter, its bands visible, its moons aligned like tiny pearls. He stared at the photo on his screen, disbelieving. Tears blurred his vision, but the image remained sharp. It was real. He had done it. He rushed to share it with the online group, posting, "My first astrophotography success at 68 years old. Jupiter and its moons. Proof that it's never too late to learn something new." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of comments poured in, praising his perseverance, thanking him for inspiring them. Some even called him the Star Grandpa, a nickname that made him chuckle. But the greatest impact came when Ryan saw the picture. His grandson's eyes widened in awe. "Grandpa, you took that? With your telescope?" Harold nodded, pride swelling in his chest. Ryan hugged him tightly. "That's amazing. You're amazing." In that hug, Harold felt something break through, the wall of distance that grief and age had built between him and his family. He wasn't just tolerated, he was admired. And in Ryan's eyes, he saw a reflection of his younger self, curious, daring, unafraid to dream. Encouraged, Harold set a new goal. He wanted to capture something more difficult, something that had haunted him since his youth, the Andromeda Galaxy. He had seen it faintly through telescopes decades ago, but to photograph it, to hold an image of another galaxy millions of light-years away, felt like a true conquest. Night after night, he tried. Clouds frustrated him, equipment failed, his hands shook with fatigue, but he pressed on. Each failure was another step, another lesson. And finally, one late October night, the breakthrough came. The sky was crystal clear, the air crisp. He aligned the telescope with painstaking care, adjusted the camera, and let the exposure run. Minutes ticked by. When the image appeared, his breath caught. There it was, the faint, glowing spiral of Andromeda, delicate yet immense, stretching across the dark. Not perfect, not professional, but unmistakable. Another galaxy, captured by his hands. Harold sat back, tears streaming down his cheeks. He whispered into the night, "Margaret, look. I did it. I really did it." The next day, he printed the image and framed it. He placed it on the mantel beside Margaret's photo, the two gazing out together, the love of his life and the dream of his life, side by side. To Harold, it was more than a picture. It was proof that he was not finished, proof that wonder could be reclaimed, proof that life after 65 was not a slow fade but a canvas still waiting for color. He began speaking more boldly online, encouraging others not to shrink from their passions. His words resonated, spreading beyond the forums into larger communities. One day, he received an email from a local school teacher who had seen his posts. She asked if he would be willing to speak to her students about astronomy and never giving up on dreams. At first, Harold balked. Him? A speaker? But then he thought of the girl who squealed at Saturn, of Ryan's shining eyes, of Musk standing on stage declaring impossible things possible. He wrote back simply, "Yes. I'd be honored." That invitation marked the beginning of something Harold never expected. His private rebellion had broken through the walls of solitude and was now reaching others. And in sharing his journey, he realized something profound: the stars were not just distant lights to be admired. They were beacons, calling him, and everyone willing to look up, toward renewal, resilience, and the infinite. The success with Andromeda gave Harold something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: confidence. Not arrogance, not a sense of superiority, but a quiet, resolute certainty that he could still learn, still create, still inspire. The telescope had become more than a tool, it was a symbol of his own defiance against time, a reminder that age was not a cage but a challenge. One morning, while sipping coffee at the kitchen table, he found himself scrolling through his online posts. Comments still poured in from strangers all over the country. "You've inspired me to pick up my guitar again. I'm 70 and just signed up for pottery classes. Thank you. You remind me that life doesn't end when society says it should." Harold smiled, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't felt in decades. His voice, once quiet and hesitant, was now carrying farther than he had ever imagined. That same afternoon, Susan called. "Dad, something weird happened today. The school emailed me about a guest speaker for the science club, and guess who they asked?" Harold raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me, it's me." Susan laughed. "Yes, you. They saw your posts and wanted you to come share your journey with the students. They said you're a real inspiration." Harold felt a rush of disbelief and pride. He hesitated for a moment, thinking of the old Harold, the man who would have declined quietly, fearing he wasn't good enough, young enough, relevant enough. But the new Harold, the one who had wrestled with fear, pain, and doubt, knew the answer immediately. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll go." The school auditorium was buzzing with teenagers, the air thick with the energy of anticipation. Harold adjusted his tie nervously, glanced at the rows of seats, and took a deep breath. When he stepped to the podium, he saw faces full of curiosity, some skeptical, some wide-eyed, and he felt that familiar flutter in his chest. But then he remembered the telescope, the late nights under the stars, the emails and messages from strangers who had found hope in his words. He smiled. "Good afternoon," he began. "I want to tell you a story. Not just about the stars, but about what it means to keep reaching, no matter your age, your setbacks, or what the world thinks is possible." He spoke of his childhood fascination with the cosmos, of his love for invention, of Margaret, who had always encouraged curiosity. He told them about the decades of ordinary life, the years he had spent feeling invisible, the grief of losing a partner, the fear of fading into nothing. Then he shared his recent journey, restoring the telescope, learning astrophotography, posting online, reconnecting with his daughter and grandson, and finding a community that encouraged him. He spoke candidly about fear, pain, and doubt, and he spoke even more about resilience, curiosity, and daring to try. By the time he showed the photograph of Andromeda, the room was silent. Students leaned forward, captivated, whispering in awe. Some pulled out their phones, snapping photos of the screen, while others simply stared, imagining the vast galaxy as he had captured it. When he finished, a hand went up immediately. A girl with glasses asked, "Mr. Bennett, why didn't you give up when it got hard?" Harold paused, thinking carefully. Because I realized that giving up is permanent. Even pain, even fear, even mistakes, they all pass. But quitting leaves you empty. The stars are always there. You just need to keep looking. Another student added, so it's never too late. Harold smiled. Never too late. Life doesn't have an expiration date. The only limit is the one you let define you. After the presentation, dozens of students approached him, asking questions about photography, telescopes, and astronomy. Some just wanted to shake his hand, to say they were inspired. Harold felt a glow he hadn't expected. He wasn't just sharing knowledge, he was sharing courage. His voice, timid and unsure in the past, now carried, echoing in the hearts of those young minds. When he returned home, he found Susan in the kitchen. "Dad, they loved you," she said, hugging him. "You were amazing. I've never seen you so alive." Harold chuckled. "I guess I found my second act." That night, he returned to the backyard. The telescope stood ready, waiting. He peered at Saturn first, its rings sharp and luminous. Then he shifted to a faint nebula he had been trying to capture. The sky was clear, the air cool, and he felt that familiar thrill of possibility. For the first time, Harold realized that the telescope was no longer just a machine, it was a microphone, amplifying his voice, reaching farther than he ever could have alone. Through it, he spoke to the stars, to his past, to those who felt forgotten, and to the future generations watching him now. Each photograph, each online post, each conversation with a student was a testament. Life could be reclaimed at any age, and every small action had the power to ripple outward. Weeks turned into months, and Harold's influence quietly grew. Local newspapers wrote short pieces about the "Star Grandpa," highlighting his journey from grief and isolation to inspiration and connection. An amateur astronomy club in the neighboring town invited him to speak. Even Susan and Ryan grew more involved, sometimes assisting him with observations and sharing the images online. Harold's house no longer felt like a place of quiet resignation. It had become a hub of energy, curiosity, and community. Yet Harold remained humble. He knew the real breakthrough wasn't the photographs, nor the applause, nor even the online praise. It was the transformation within himself, the courage to defy fear, to continue learning, to engage with life fully, to allow his voice to carry beyond the walls of his home. One night, while reviewing the images he had captured over the past year, he realized something profound. The telescope had done more than show him the universe, it had shown him who he truly was. Not an old man fading into obscurity, but a man capable of daring, of inspiring, of connecting across generations and distance. And he understood that this voice, this flicker of influence, could continue to grow as long as he remained willing to reach. He sat back, staring at the photograph of a distant galaxy, and whispered softly, "I was never too old to matter. I just had to speak up." The stars outside seemed to shimmer brighter that night, as if acknowledging the truth, that life, no matter its stage, still held infinite potential for those brave enough to grasp it. By now, Harold had begun to notice something remarkable. His actions, small and deliberate, were no longer contained within the walls of his home or the limits of his backyard telescope. Each post, each shared photograph, each talk at the school carried a ripple far beyond what he could see, touching lives in ways he never imagined. It began subtly. Emails arrived from strangers thanking him for reigniting their own passions, from a retired teacher who had returned to writing poetry, from a widower who had taken up woodworking again, from a woman who had begun training for a marathon at 70. Harold read each message with awe and a quiet, almost disbelieving pride. He realized he was witnessing a network of inspiration, a web of courage stretching across time zones and towns, all tracing back to his decision to stand up, to risk failure, to share. The telescope, once a tool for solitude, had become a beacon for connection. Even Susan began to notice the change. She called him one afternoon, excitement in her voice. "Dad, I don't know how it happened, but you've created a small movement. Students in Ryan's class are starting their own observation clubs. One kid even started a blog sharing star photos. People are talking about you in their communities. Harold chuckled, but beneath the amusement was awe. He had never intended to start anything, never imagined that his quiet defiance against age and isolation could generate such momentum. Yet, as he thought about it, it made sense. Inspiration was contagious. Courage was contagious. Persistence was contagious. And when combined with technology, even a single person's voice could carry across the globe. Encouraged, Harold decided to take the next step. He reached out to a local library and offered to host a small weekly astronomy workshop for seniors. "If I can start again at 68, he wrote, so can anyone else." The library agreed, intrigued by the idea, and within a few weeks, Harold found himself teaching a dozen older adults, some hesitant, some eager, all curious. They laughed together at first, fumbling with telescopes, struggling with camera attachments, learning to navigate the sky with shaky hands. Harold guided them patiently, encouraging them to embrace mistakes as part of discovery. He shared not just techniques, but lessons about fear, age, and possibility. One woman, Margie, said softly during a session, "I always thought I was too old to start anything new. Watching you, Harold, I realize I was just scared." Harold smiled warmly, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Fear is normal. The trick is not letting it stop you. Every small step counts. And if you take those steps, no matter how late, you'll be amazed at what you can do." Word spread. The senior workshops grew, drawing retirees from neighboring towns. People brought stories of their own lost dreams. Painting, writing, music, gardening, even travel they had postponed for decades. Harold encouraged each one, framing each effort as a form of rebellion against the limits society and self-imposed doubts had tried to place. Outside of these workshops, Harold's online presence also evolved. He started posting not just images of planets and galaxies, but narratives about rediscovering life, combating fear, and reclaiming agency in the later years. His followers expanded, comments flowing in by the hundreds. "You give me hope that it's not too late to chase my dreams. I started learning guitar at 71 because of you. Thank you for reminding me life doesn't end at retirement." Each note struck Harold deeply. He began responding personally to many, fostering a sense of community. People he had never met were sharing their lives, challenges, and small victories, forming a chain of encouragement. One evening, as he sat reviewing comments, he felt a tug of nostalgia and pride. His life, once defined by loss and quiet resignation, was now defined by ripples, small acts creating waves, expanding outward, touching those who felt invisible. The ripple effect became tangible in unexpected ways. Ryan, inspired by Harold, began helping seniors with technology, teaching them how to set up cameras, adjust telescopes, and even document their work online. Susan, previously skeptical, joined in as a volunteer, seeing firsthand how her father's courage was fostering community. Harold marveled at the synergy. The private spark he had ignited in himself had now illuminated others' lives, and they, in turn, fueled him with energy he hadn't felt since his youth. One night, he looked at the sky and realized that the stars had become metaphors for human potential. Each light in the darkness represented someone daring to reach, someone refusing to fade quietly, someone igniting ripples that could travel far beyond their immediate circle. He thought about Elon Musk again, not as a literal guide, but as a symbol of audacity, of refusing to accept conventional limitations. Musk had taken on challenges that seemed impossible, and Harold had mirrored that audacity in his own way, proving that age was not a barrier to risk or reinvention. A particularly meaningful ripple occurred when a local television station approached Harold for an interview. They had seen his online posts, heard about the workshops, and wanted to feature him as the star grandpa. Sitting in the studio, camera lights warm against his face, Harold felt a mix of nerves and exhilaration. When asked why he had embarked on this journey at his age, he spoke from the heart. "I realize that life doesn't stop just because society says it should. Every day is a chance to rediscover curiosity, to embrace fear, and to act on what matters. Age is a number, courage is a choice. The segment aired that evening. Calls and emails flooded in, from seniors eager to join his workshops, from families inspired to engage with their older relatives, from teenagers curious about the stars. Harold realized that the ripples were expanding beyond even his own imagination. His quiet rebellion against invisibility had become a beacon. He felt a profound gratitude for every message, every smile, every connection. These ripples weren't just validation, they were proof that one person's choice to act, even late in life, could have tangible effects on countless others. As autumn faded into winter, Harold reflected on the journey. He thought of the chest pain, the nights of doubt, the silence that once filled his home. Now, every day brought interaction, challenge, growth, and inspiration. He had become both participant and facilitator in a living, breathing network of discovery and courage. And yet, he remained humble, always aware that this journey was ongoing. The ripple effect was infinite, and there was always another spark to kindle, another person to encourage, another star to reach. One cold December night, as snow fell softly outside, Harold set up the telescope for a final observation before the holiday season. The sky was crisp, clear, and filled with twinkling stars. He thought of every email, every student, every workshop attendee who had been touched by his efforts. He thought of Ryan and Susan, of neighbors who had smiled at his eccentricity, of strangers who had found hope in his words. Each thought made the cold air feel warmer, each memory a light in the darkness. Peering through the telescope, Harold caught a glimpse of a distant nebula, faint and ethereal. It was beautiful, unclaimed, and infinite. And he understood then that this was what his journey had become, not just seeing stars, but connecting them, linking lives, passing hope along in a chain that would continue long after any one of them had gone. The ripple effect, Harold realized, was life itself. And in that realization, he felt complete, not finished, but alive, capable, and profoundly, gloriously present. By the time winter had fully settled over Harold's small town, he felt an unfamiliar energy coursing through him. The ripple effect of his actions, the warmth of community, and the renewed connection with his family had transformed his daily life. But more than comfort, Harold craved a challenge that would truly test the limits of his body, mind, and spirit. The telescope had given him vision, the workshops had given him purpose, and the recognition had given him confidence, but he realized that crossing thresholds, the act of moving beyond familiar boundaries, was essential to truly embracing his second act. It began with a quiet thought one evening as he adjusted the telescope to observe a distant cluster of stars. What if I could reach further than ever before? What if I didn't just look at the stars, but documented them for others in a more meaningful way? The idea gnawed at him, daring him to step out of the comfort zone he had carefully built. The first threshold was not physical, but creative. Harold decided to compile a guidebook for amateur astronomers his age, a combination of technical instruction, inspiration, and personal narrative. He wanted to show others that age was not a barrier to discovery, that one could learn, create, and contribute at any stage of life. Each night, he pored over notes, photographs, and stories, sometimes staying up until the early hours to arrange ideas into chapters. His fingers trembled from typing, his eyes strained, and yet he persisted. The project was daunting, far more complex than restoring a telescope or capturing a single image, but the challenge thrilled him. With every page, he was crossing a threshold into new territory, proving to himself that he could not only participate in life but shape it. The second threshold was public exposure. Harold had grown comfortable teaching workshops and speaking to small groups, but the idea of sharing his story with a wider audience both exhilarated and terrified him. When a local radio station contacted him to speak about the guidebook and his journey, he hesitated. Could a 69-year-old widower really hold the attention of an audience beyond his town? But then he remembered Musk's words from a clip he had watched months ago: if something is important enough, you should do it even if the odds are not in your favor. He realized the odds weren't in his favor, his age, his inexperience with public radio, but that was exactly why he had to try. The day of the broadcast arrived. Harold stood in the studio, the warm glow of the microphones reflecting off the glass panels. The host welcomed him warmly, and soon Harold found himself speaking about the telescope, the astrophotography, the workshops, and the guidebook. But he also spoke about more than astronomy. He spoke about courage, about defying expectations, about reclaiming life at an age society often writes off as over. When asked what message he hoped listeners would take away, he answered simply, "It's never too late. Whatever you've wanted to do, however long you've waited, take the first step today. Age is a number, but your determination is infinite." The broadcast was a success. Listeners sent emails, called the station, and posted on social media. People expressed gratitude, shared their own stories, and committed to action. Harold realized that crossing thresholds wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about proving to himself that limits were often illusions, constructs he could dismantle with persistence and courage. The third threshold was more personal, reconnecting with a lifelong friend, Samuel, whom he hadn't spoken to in nearly 30 years. They had fallen out over a business dispute long ago, and pride had kept them apart. But now, emboldened by his recent triumphs and inspired by the ripple effect of his actions, Harold reached for the phone. The first call was tentative. "Hello, Samuel, it's Harold Bennett. I know it's been a long time, but I wanted to talk." Silence followed. Then Samuel's voice, aged and cautious but familiar, "Harold. I wasn't expecting this." Harold swallowed hard. "I know. But I've realized life is too short for old grudges. I'd like to start over, if you're willing." A long pause, then a hesitant laugh. "I think that's long overdue. Let's start fresh." They arranged to meet the following week. When they finally shook hands in the cafe, years of estrangement melted away, replaced by shared memories, laughter, and the easy camaraderie that comes from long friendship. Harold marveled at how crossing personal thresholds, the uncomfortable, vulnerable acts of reaching out, could yield rewards deeper than any telescope or photograph. Each threshold he crossed taught him something new. Courage was not absence of fear, but action despite fear. Growth was not measured by accomplishments alone, but by willingness to step beyond what was comfortable. Encouraged, Harold began to dream even bigger. He set his sights on a regional astronomy competition, submitting his astrophotography images for review. The thought of competing terrified him. He was no professional, the judges were seasoned photographers and astronomers. But again, Musk's ethos whispered in his mind, risk, innovate, persist. Submission day arrived, and Harold mailed the prints, his hands shaking with anticipation. Weeks later, he received a call from the competition committee. His photographs had been selected for exhibition, with one winning a special recognition award for creativity and perseverance. He felt a surge of pride not in the accolades themselves, but in having dared to cross yet another boundary, entering a space reserved for the young and experienced, and emerging recognized for his vision and effort. Each threshold crossed fueled another. Harold realized he could not stop here. He began mentoring others online, guiding seniors who had taken up photography, telescope restoration, and science exploration. He connected with retirees across the country, offering advice, encouragement, and practical tips. The network he had ignited grew exponentially, each person taking their own steps into unknown territory. One night, while looking at the Milky Way, Harold reflected on how far he had come. He had moved from fear to action, from isolation to connection, from doubt to recognition. Each threshold, personal, creative, social, professional, had expanded his universe, not just in terms of knowledge or skill, but in the depth of his courage and the reach of his influence. He realized that the act of crossing thresholds was not about achieving perfection or acclaim. It was about daring to enter spaces that life or age had previously made him believe were closed, and discovering that those spaces were wide open, filled with possibility. With each new challenge, each risk taken, Harold felt more alive than he had in decades. And under the vast winter sky, brimming with stars that had always been there but only now seemed close enough to touch, Harold understood the essence of his transformation. The human spirit was not limited by years, and the power to shape one's life lay in the willingness to cross thresholds, one daring step at a time. The following spring, Harold felt the stirrings of something new, a sense that his life was poised at the edge of a greater possibility. All the small victories, the workshops, the exhibitions, the restored friendships, they had built momentum, but he knew the true test of transformation was not in accumulation, but in a singular, catalytic moment that forced him to confront everything he had become and everything he still wanted to be. It arrived unexpectedly. One morning, as Harold opened his emails, he noticed a message from a technology magazine he had never heard of. The subject line read, "Feature Opportunity, Seniors Innovating in Science and Tech." His curiosity piqued, Harold clicked. The editor explained they had been following his posts, photographs, and workshops, and wanted to feature him in a full-length article about seniors defying expectations, pursuing science, and sharing knowledge with younger generations. Harold blinked. Not a blog mention, not a local paper, an international platform, the kind that could reach thousands, maybe millions. His hands trembled, a mix of excitement and fear. He knew this was the catalyst moment he had been waiting for, the chance to amplify the ripple effect, to demonstrate that age was not a limitation, and to inspire far beyond his own town. But fear surged immediately. Do I deserve this? Am I really worthy of this attention? What if I fail under the spotlight? The old Harold might have retreated, deleted the email, returned to his quiet life. The new Harold, however, paused, drew in a steadying breath, and remembered every threshold he had crossed, the school talks, the workshops, the competitions, the estranged friend he had reconciled with, the online network he had nurtured. Each had seemed impossible until he acted. This was just another threshold, and he was ready. He replied, agreeing to the feature, and began preparing. He gathered his best astrophotographs, compiled stories from students and seniors whose lives had been touched by his guidance, and wrote a personal narrative describing his journey from grief, fear, and invisibility to connection, creativity, and purpose. Every night, he rehearsed the story he would tell the journalist, refining not just the facts, but the emotional resonance, the lessons learned, the moments of vulnerability, the triumphs, and the humbling realizations. When the journalist arrived, Harold felt the familiar twinge of anxiety, but he greeted her with a smile and led her to the backyard, where the telescope stood as a silent testament to his persistence. She watched as he adjusted the lens, explained the camera settings, and captured an image of a distant nebula. "You've built more than a telescope," she said, observing him. "You've built a movement." Harold chuckled softly. "I never intended it. I just started looking at the sky again." Everything else followed. The interview flowed naturally. Harold spoke candidly about fear, age, isolation, and the courage it takes to reclaim life. He described how a spark of inspiration, from watching a video of Elon Musk declaring the importance of daring, from the simple act of deciding not to quit, had transformed him. He recounted every threshold crossed, every ripple he had seen in the lives of others, and every lesson learned. By the time the session ended, the journalist was visibly moved, and Harold felt an unfamiliar pride, not of ego, but of accomplishment. Weeks later, the feature was published online, its reach far surpassing anything Harold had imagined. The response was instantaneous. Emails, social media messages, and letters poured in from across the country, from senior citizens inspired to take up old dreams, from families rediscovering connections, from educators eager to implement similar workshops. One email from a woman in Florida stood out, "I'm 72 and have been too scared to pursue painting again. Reading your story gave me the courage to pick up my brushes tonight. Thank you for showing me it's never too late." Another came from a retired engineer in Ohio, "Your journey reminds me of Musk's philosophy, challenge the impossible. I'm inspired to start building again, even at 68." Harold realized that this catalyst moment, amplified by modern technology and human connection, had elevated his personal journey into a movement. It was proof that one act of courage could ignite a far-reaching chain reaction. And yet, amid the praise and attention, Harold remained grounded. He understood that the true value of this moment was not recognition, but responsibility, the responsibility to continue living authentically, inspiring others, and passing the torch of possibility. One afternoon, Susan visited, a stack of letters from readers in her hand. "Dad, look at this. They're all writing to you. Some are starting their own clubs, some are teaching themselves astronomy, some are just taking steps they'd been too afraid to take." Harold scanned the letters, the handwriting and printed messages carrying gratitude, hope, and courage. He felt a surge of emotion. "It's overwhelming," he admitted, tears welling in his eyes. "I never imagined this." Susan embraced him. "You earned it, Dad. You didn't just look at stars, you made them reachable for everyone." That night, Harold set up the telescope in the backyard as he had done countless times before. The sky stretched above, vast and unending, filled with stars that had always existed but now seemed almost alive, connected to the lives he had touched. He adjusted the lens carefully, framed the nebula, and captured the perfect exposure. Looking at the image, he whispered, "Margaret, this is the moment we dreamed of. The ripple is growing. People are seeing, reaching, believing." And he realized that the catalyst moment had not just been the article or the recognition, it had been the culmination of every choice, every small act, every refusal to quit, every threshold crossed. The catalyst was life itself, demanding courage, persistence, and hope. Harold understood that from this point, the journey was exponential. One inspired soul could spark another, and each ripple, each voice, each act of courage could travel farther than he could imagine. The telescope was no longer just a personal instrument. It was a symbol of action, of audacity, of the belief that one's life could still matter. And in the quiet of that night, as stars shimmered and the camera captured their light, Harold felt a profound clarity. He was not just living his second act, he was amplifying it, carrying it forward, inviting others to do the same. The catalyst moment had arrived, and it was more than recognition, it was transformation realized, a bridge between personal triumph and collective inspiration. And Harold Bennett, standing under the infinite sky, felt the weight of possibility pressing on his shoulders, exhilarating, demanding, unstoppable. The catalyst moment of the feature article had done more than amplify Harold's personal journey, it had launched him into a new plane of influence, a summit of impact that he had never dared to imagine. The emails, the calls, the social media messages had become a steady stream, a river of human stories flowing back to him, each one a testament to the power of action, courage, and hope. But Harold knew that influence alone was not enough. To truly reach the summit, he had to combine visibility with meaningful guidance, creating not just admiration, but tangible change in the lives of those who looked to him. He began by formalizing the network he had unintentionally created. Using the contacts from his workshops, the schools, and the readers inspired by his online presence, he founded the Stellar Horizons Project, a small but ambitious program connecting seniors with tools, knowledge, and mentorship to explore science, art, and creativity anew. The first meeting was held in the town library, a room filled with anticipation. Some attendees were apprehensive, unsure if they could contribute anything meaningful at their age. Others, like Harold, were hungry to learn, to challenge themselves, to reclaim pieces of life they thought they had lost. Harold opened the session with a smile. "This is more than a club. This is a movement. A chance to rediscover the life you've always wanted to live. You are not too late. You are not invisible. You are here, now, and that is enough to start everything." As the weeks progressed, the Stellar Horizons Project gained momentum. Seniors who had never touched a camera began capturing celestial images. Retired engineers built small robotic devices and experimented with coding. Artists who had laid down brushes decades ago began painting their visions of space, of nature, of life itself. Harold's role was not to dominate, but to facilitate, to guide, to encourage, to illuminate possibilities. He shared stories of his own failures and triumphs, the threshold crossings, the catalyst moments, and the ripple effect. Each story served as proof that the impossible was often just an illusion. One evening, a woman named Eleanor, 81, approached him with tears in her eyes. "I thought I had nothing left to give," she said. "But watching you, hearing your story, seeing how you kept reaching, it's given me courage. I started a small garden for the first time in 30 years, and I'm teaching my grandchildren how to plant seeds." Harold placed a hand over hers, moved deeply by her words. "That's what it's all about," he said softly. "Every small action matters. Every seed you plant, literal or figurative, will grow in ways you can't yet imagine." Beyond the workshops, Harold also began leveraging technology more intentionally. He recorded video tutorials, hosted live online discussions, and encouraged members to document and share their own journeys. Slowly, the movement extended beyond the physical boundaries of his town. Seniors in other states, inspired by his story and guided by the materials he provided, formed their own chapters. Letters and videos arrived from places Harold had never visited: California, New York, Texas, each filled with gratitude, excitement, and innovation. In each message, he sensed a profound truth: empowerment was contagious, and courage could traverse both distance and age. The summit of impact was not measured in numbers alone. Harold realized it was also in the stories of transformation: the retired nurse learning astrophotography, the widower rebuilding a model train empire, the grandmother composing a musical inspired by the night sky. Each act of renewed purpose became a reflection of the possibilities Harold had discovered in himself. And then came an unexpected invitation. The organizers of a national senior innovation conference asked Harold to be a keynote speaker. The idea terrified him. Speaking to a national audience, representing a movement, sharing his story of loss, rediscovery, and courage, could he convey the depth of it all? Could he inspire others as profoundly as the ripple effect had suggested? But Harold remembered the first step: crossing thresholds. Every triumph had come from daring to enter spaces that once seemed closed. He accepted immediately. Standing on stage at the conference, the lights bright and the audience hushed, Harold began his talk. He shared the full arc of his journey: the grief, the solitude, the chest pain that threatened to halt him, the telescope, the workshops, the mentor-student connections, the online ripple, and the creation of the Stellar Horizons project. He spoke candidly about fear, failure, and self-doubt, then about resilience, curiosity, and courage. And he connected it all to the limitless potential of each person in the audience, no matter age or circumstance. As he spoke, he noticed the reactions: eyes widening, nodding, some glistening with tears. When he finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. People lined up afterward to shake his hand, share their own stories, ask questions, and thank him for inspiring them. One young woman told him she was studying neuroscience because she felt empowered to pursue knowledge despite setbacks. Another man said he had decided to reconnect with his estranged brother, and a retired teacher explained she had started offering STEM workshops in her retirement community. Harold felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. He had reached the summit, not through personal accolades, but by sparking purpose, courage, and action in others. He realized that influence, when combined with meaningful guidance and mentorship, had exponential power. And he also recognized that the summit was not static. It wasn't a peak to rest upon, but a vantage point to see the countless new possibilities ahead, to inspire yet more individuals, to extend the ripple effect further than he could have imagined. That night, back in his quiet home, Harold looked at the telescope one final time before bed. The stars stretched endlessly above, each one a reminder that boundaries were illusions and potential was infinite. He felt gratitude for every choice that had led him here: the refusal to give up, the courage to cross thresholds, the decision to speak up, the commitment to act despite fear. And as he stared into the distant galaxies, he understood something profound: the summit of impact was not the end of the journey. It was the realization that by living fully, acting boldly, and inspiring others, one could create a legacy of courage and possibility that would endure far beyond a single lifetime. Harold whispered into the night, "This is only the beginning. The stars are endless, and so are the opportunities to reach them." And for the first time in years, he felt entirely, irreversibly alive. Spring had fully arrived, and with it, a sense of anticipation that Harold couldn't shake. Despite the success of the Stellar Horizons project, the national recognition, and the summit of impact, he felt that the true test of his journey was approaching, an unavoidable, undeniable moment of truth that would determine whether all his efforts, risks, and courage could withstand scrutiny and adversity. It came in the form of an invitation from a prominent scientific organization to present his work at a prestigious symposium. Unlike the senior conference or local workshops, this audience was composed of professional astronomers, astrophotographers, and scientists, many of whom had decades of experience and accolades far beyond anything Harold had achieved. The weight of expectation, the potential for failure, loomed larger than he had ever felt. When the invitation arrived, Harold's first instinct was fear. What if they see me as an amateur, a novice, an imposter? What if my years of learning are dismissed because I started late, because I'm not formally trained? He wrestled with the doubts in silence, pacing the backyard at dusk, peering through the telescope at familiar constellations, seeking clarity among the stars. Susan noticed his unease and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, you've faced fear before," she said. "You've crossed thresholds, sparked ripples, and reached summits. This is just another stage. You're ready." Harold nodded, grateful for her encouragement, but the anxiety remained. In the weeks leading up to the symposium, he prepared meticulously. He refined his presentation, rehearsed every line, double-checked his astrophotographs, and compiled the narratives of those inspired by his work. Every detail mattered, every word carried weight. Yet no amount of preparation could eliminate the gnawing fear. The day arrived. Harold stepped into the grand auditorium, its vaulted ceilings echoing the soft hum of conversation. Rows of professionals in crisp attire and polished demeanor filled the seats. He felt the old familiar flutter of inadequacy, the sense of being too late, too inexperienced, too ordinary. But then he recalled Musk's philosophy: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. And Harold reminded himself that this moment, daunting as it was not about impressing others. It was about demonstrating that courage, curiosity, and persistence could overcome age, doubt, and fear. When his name was called, he walked to the podium, adjusting his notes with steady hands. The room fell silent, the spotlight illuminating his figure. He began with a simple acknowledgement of his own journey. "I am not a professional scientist. I am not a formally trained astrophotographer. I am, however, someone who refused to accept the limitations of age, grief, and fear. What I bring today is the story of discovery, of persistence, and of the power to inspire." He then presented his work, the astrophotographs, each one captured with precision and patience, the narratives of seniors and students he had mentored, the creation of the Stellar Horizons project and its ripple effect across communities. But beyond the technical achievements, Harold shared his philosophy, that every individual, no matter their age or circumstance, could contribute meaningfully, pursue passion, and impact the lives of others. The room remained still, attentive. Questions came, some skeptical, some curious. Harold responded with honesty, humility, and clarity. He did not claim expertise he didn't have, but he spoke passionately about perseverance, the importance of mentorship, and the courage to act. Slowly, skepticism began to give way to admiration. Colleagues leaned forward, nodding at his insights, impressed not just by his photographs, but by the story of resilience and purpose behind them. By the end of the presentation, the auditorium erupted in applause. Harold felt a rush of exhilaration, but more importantly, he felt validation, not the shallow kind tied to ego, but the deep kind that comes from meeting fear head-on, stepping into the unknown, and affirming one's own worth through action. One of the lead astronomers approached him afterward, extending a hand. Harold, I must say, I underestimated the value of your perspective. Your work is not only technically impressive but inspiring in a way that many of us rarely see. Thank you for reminding us why we pursue science in the first place. Harold smiled, a mixture of relief and pride swelling within him. Thank you, he replied. But the real reward is seeing others discover that they too can reach beyond what they thought possible. Later that evening, back in his hotel room, Harold reflected on the day. He thought of every fear he had overcome. The grief that had once immobilized him, the doubts that had silenced his voice, the thresholds crossed in workshops, competitions, and community outreach. All of it had led to this moment of truth, proving that action, courage, and persistence transcended age, experience, and societal expectation. But Harold realized the moment of truth was not about recognition. It was about transformation, both his own and that of those he had touched. He thought of Eleanor, the woman who had begun gardening at 81, of students who had started their own observation clubs, of strangers inspired to pursue passions they had abandoned decades earlier. Their growth, their courage, their renewed sense of purpose validated his journey far more than any applause or award could. That night, Harold stood by the window, looking out at the city lights beneath a sky filled with stars. He felt the familiar calm, the quiet elation of someone who had faced fear and emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to the world. The symposium had been a crucible, testing his resolve, and he had not just survived, it had elevated him, reaffirmed his philosophy, and strengthened his mission to inspire. He realized that the moment of truth was not a singular event, but an ongoing process, showing up, persisting, mentoring, sharing, daring, and living fully, regardless of age or circumstance. And in that understanding, Harold felt a profound sense of peace. He whispered into the night, I am not defined by age, doubt, or fear. I am defined by courage, persistence, and the lives I touch. In that quiet room, surrounded by distant city lights and under the infinite sky, Harold Bennett understood that his journey was not about personal accolades, but about the enduring impact of living boldly, embracing possibility, and crossing every threshold that life placed before him. The moment of truth had arrived, and Harold had met it with integrity, passion, and unshakable courage. And for the first time in decades, he felt the fullness of life in a way that was not just visible to others, but profoundly true within himself. Harold returned home from the symposium carrying not just memories, but a sense of responsibility heavier and more inspiring than any he had ever felt. The moment of truth had proven to him that age was no boundary, that courage could redefine limits, and that one person's choice to act could ripple outward, touching lives in ways unimaginable. Yet the journey wasn't just about what Harold had achieved. It was about what he could leave behind, the legacy of hope, courage, and relentless curiosity he could inspire in others long after he was gone. Over the following months, Harold began consolidating his experiences into something enduring. He published a comprehensive guidebook titled Stellar Horizons, Rediscovering Life Through Curiosity and Courage, blending astrophotography, personal narrative, and practical advice for seniors eager to reclaim passions, defy fear, and inspire change. Each chapter was infused with lessons drawn from his own life, the loss that once silenced him, the grief he had transformed into motivation, the thresholds he had crossed, the ripple effects he had witnessed, and the moments of truth that had tested and refined him. Harold knew that words alone were not enough. He expanded the Stellar Horizons project into a mentorship platform, pairing older adults with younger generations to foster shared learning and intergenerational connection. Retirees taught technology, science, and arts, teens brought new perspectives, energy, and creativity. Together, they formed a network where knowledge, curiosity, and courage flowed freely, creating a living, evolving legacy that transcended the limits of a single life. One Saturday afternoon, Harold watched from the back of the library as a group of seniors taught a class to local high school students. Laughter filled the room, questions flew back and forth, and the energy was palpable. A woman in her 70s demonstrated how to attach a camera to a telescope, a teenage boy recorded the images for an online gallery, a retired teacher guided them in charting constellations. Harold's heart swelled. This was the tangible proof that a life lived courageously had consequences far beyond personal satisfaction. The legacy was now alive in action, in mentorship, in shared curiosity. He walked quietly through the room, letting the moment sink in, realizing that the true measure of impact was not in recognition, awards, or social media mentions, but in the lives touched, the passions rekindled, and the barriers shattered. Even in private moments, the changes were evident. Susan and Ryan had grown immensely, inspired by Harold's example of resilience and audacity. Susan had begun volunteering as a mentor herself, guiding young and old alike through science and photography projects. Ryan, once shy and reserved, had started leading workshops, showing confidence and initiative that surprised even him. Harold saw that his influence was not only external but internal within his family. Values of courage, persistence, and curiosity had been passed on organically, shaping the next generation to carry the legacy forward. And yet, Harold remained humble. He knew that his journey was not about personal glory. It was about creating a framework for empowerment, about showing that anyone, at any age, could reclaim agency over their life, pursue passions once thought impossible, and inspire others along the way. One evening, he set up the telescope in the backyard, the familiar cool air of spring brushing against his face. The sky stretched endlessly above, filled with stars that seemed brighter than ever. He adjusted the camera, capturing the faint glow of a distant nebula, and paused to reflect. Each star was a metaphor, some for dreams rekindled, some for risks taken, some for lives touched. Each photograph, each student, each senior who had found courage, was a testament to the infinite potential of a life lived fully, courageously, and intentionally. Harold thought of Elon Musk, not as a literal presence, but as a symbol of audacity, of radical thinking, and the refusal to be confined by limits imposed by society, circumstance, or age. Musk had sparked a mindset in Harold, igniting the first ember that had grown into a wildfire of action and inspiration. And Harold understood that the legacy he was building carried the same spirit, not technological conquest, but the conquest of fear, doubt, and perceived limitations. Weeks later, Harold received a letter from a young astronomer he had met at the symposium. "Mr. Bennett," it began, "your journey has changed the way I approach both science and life. I've started a program connecting retired engineers with local students to build small telescopes and launch weather balloons. Your example proves that it's never too late to take initiative. Thank you for showing us how courage and curiosity can redefine life." Harold smiled as he read the words, a profound satisfaction warming him from the inside out. This was the essence of legacy, not trophies, accolades, or fame, but the inspiration to act, to create, and to live boldly passed from one life to another. In quiet moments, Harold often reflected on the past, the grief that once immobilized him, the loneliness that had seemed permanent, the fear that had stifled his voice. Those experiences, once sources of despair, were now the foundation of wisdom, empathy, and guidance. He had transformed loss into purpose, invisibility into influence, and hesitation into audacity. One Sunday, as he walked through the local park, a group of seniors waved to him, carrying notebooks, cameras, and star charts. They were planning an evening observation, and Harold had been invited to lead. Children joined them, curiosity sparkling in their eyes, while parents observed from a distance, quietly moved by the intergenerational collaboration. Harold joined in, guiding the setup of telescopes, sharing tips, and answering questions. The laughter, the questions, the shared awe at the cosmos, all of it felt like the culmination of a life redesigned, a legacy in motion. And in that moment, Harold realized that legacy was not a final destination but an ongoing journey, a continuous act of courage, teaching, inspiring, and living fully. It was a commitment to impact, however small or large, in ways that echoed across generations. Later that night, Harold sat alone in his backyard, telescope pointed at the heavens. The world was quiet, the night air cool and crisp. He reflected on the incredible transformation of his life, from fear, doubt, and isolation to courage, action, and connection, from invisibility to influence, from grief to profound joy. And he understood something essential: he had never been too old. He had only needed permission, from himself, to matter, to act, to inspire. He whispered into the night, "I was never too old. I was just waiting to believe in my own life again." As he captured one last image of the nebula, he thought of every person whose life had been touched by his courage: the seniors reclaiming old passions, the students exploring science, the friends and family reconnecting, the strangers finding hope. The telescope became a symbol not just of the stars, but of possibility, persistence, and the power to illuminate darkness, both literal and metaphorical. And in that quiet, infinite night, Harold Bennett felt complete. Not in the sense of an ending, but in the sense of continuity, knowing that his life, actions, and courage had created a living, breathing legacy that would continue to inspire, challenge, and empower long after he was gone. The stars above glimmered endlessly, a mirror of the infinite potential within every human spirit. Harold smiled, adjusting the lens for one final glance, and whispered softly, "The journey never ends. The legacy lives on." And under that endless sky, surrounded by the quiet hum of life, Harold Bennett finally understood the full measure of his transformation. He had not just reclaimed his life, he had created a new legacy, radiant, enduring, and infinite. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?